Well, we're going to start our tour today standing on the cliff tops at Rottingdean. You can see the sea behind me. It's a lovely sunny day. Just over there in the distance you can see Brighton, and over there you can see the White Cliffs. For most of its history, Rottingdean would have been an agricultural community. It's mentioned in the Domesday Book, and its church goes back to Norman times. And it wasn't until about the middle of the 19th century that the wealthy middle classes began to discover Rottingdean. Back then it would have been a fairly isolated community. So say it's about 3.5 miles or so from Brighton to the west, whilst to the east would be the sort of small seaport of Newhaven, which is about 5 miles away. So Rottingdean would have stood on its own. In the 19th century there was a bus once a day, but that bus only carried 6 people. So it was a very isolated community. But from the late 1850s onwards, the wealthy middle classes began to discover Rottingdean. One of the reasons for that was because there was something of an agricultural decline, certainly from the 1870s onwards. People started leaving the countryside, and all these properties became available on the market, and this was where the wealthy middle classes would start buying them up. And of course what the other attraction was, it was on the coast, but it wasn't Brighton. Brighton by this time had something of a seedy reputation, and so if you were fairly wealthy and fairly middle class, you didn't particularly want to go to Brighton. But Rottingdean was ideal. It was still this very isolated rural community. And of course Kipling had an association with the village covering some 40 years of his life. He first came here in 1882. He just left the United Services College at Westwood Ho, and he came to stay with his aunt and uncle, the Burne-Joneses, who'd bought a house here in 1880. And he spent a few weeks here before he took a ship to India, to Bombay, and of course that's where he made his name, ultimately working for the Civil and Military Gazette. And of course he came back to Rottingdean some years later, after he'd married Carrie, and they'd then gone to America to live, where they had their first 2 children, Josephine and Elsie. But of course Rudyard fell out with her family, and so after 4 years they came back to England in 1896, where to begin with they went to Torquay. They stayed a few months in Torquay, didn't like Torquay, came to London, stayed in a hotel in London for a while, and then the Burne-Joneses said, why don't you come down and live in our house in Rottingdean, which they did. This is now in 1897, and they stayed with the Burne-Joneses for a few months, and of course John was born there. And then in September 1897 the Elms became available, which they moved into, paying the princely sum of 3 guineas a week. There was a time when Rudyard tried to buy the Elms for himself, but the owner, they wouldn't sell it to him. So their house hunting continued, but they were here in residence in Rottingdean for 5 years. And certainly for the first 18 months or so, it was probably one of the happiest times of their lives. But of course in 1899, in the January, they went over to America, where Josephine caught pneumonia and died, and Rudyard of course was seriously ill as well. And it wasn't until several months later that they returned to Rottingdean. And of course it's said that Rudyard never ever got over the death of Josephine. It seems as though She was his favourite daughter, favourite child, but sadly she'd gone. And as in the poem Merrow Down, she was the daughter that was all to him. But their house hunting continued. In 1900 they came across Bateman's, thought about it for a while, put an offer in for it, but it had been let by then, continued their house hunting, and then 1902 Bateman's came back on the market. But shortly before they left, I think it was in the June of 1902, Rudyard wrote his famous poem of Sussex. God gave all men all earth to love, but since man's heart is small, ordained for each one spot should prove beloved over all. That is, he watched creation's birth, so we in godlike mood may of our earth create our own and see that it is good. So yes, he loved Sussex, and of course he got to know Sussex through living in Rottingdean. And the association with Rottingdean continued, because from 1907, for a few years, John came to school at St Aubyn's, and eventually Aunt Georgie died in 1920, and that probably brought to an end his association with Rottingdean, because things were changing. The downs were being built on at Peacehaven, which was a wake-up call about what could happen to the countryside if there were no planning regulations. And he wrote in his autobiography, which of course he wrote towards the end of his life, today from Rottingdean to Newhaven is covered with suburbs of great horror. Things had changed, but as I say, that for those 40 years he knew Rottingdean much as it was, and through that he grew his love of Sussex. So he always looked back upon his time fondly here in Rottingdean, and he actually wrote in his autobiography, looking back at those days, I do not remember any violent alarms and excursions other than packing farm carts filled with mixed babies, the Baldwin children and ours, and dispatching them into the safe clean heart of the motherly downs for jam-smeared picnics. Those were exceedingly good days, and one's work came easily and fully. So, as I say, he had fond memories of Rottingdean, covering some 40 years. So we're going to now start our journey through the village and visit some of those places that meant so much to him during his time here. Right, I'm now standing by the traffic lights at Rottingdean, and for most people this is Rottingdean. They come down the hill there to the traffic lights, and then they head off up the hill through Saltdean, Peacehaven, till they eventually come to Newhaven. But all this behind me is comparatively recent, and I'm standing outside the White Horse, which was a coaching inn for many years, but the original one was pulled down in the 1930s, and this, to most people, as I say, this is their vision of Rottingdean. This is all they see. But we're going to carry on up the high street into the old part of the village, and thankfully a lot of the old village has remained, and we'll see some of those places connected with Rudyard Kipling. Well, we're now standing outside St Aubyn's School. This, of course, was where John Kipling came to school between 1907 and 1911, before he went on to school at Wellington College. It became a school in 1895 and closed round about 2013. Many famous boys were pupils here, including Sir Nicholas Soames. Churchill's grandson was a pupil here, and the explorer Wilfrid Thesiger was also a pupil here, and a number of other well-known names. So, of course, one of the reasons the Kiplings chose this as a school for John was because it meant his Aunt Georgie, was living in the village as well, so he'd have someone to call on if he so wished. We're now going to go on from here, round the corner, to visit the old chapel. As you can see, it's all boarded up and it's normally locked up, but we've very kindly been given permission today to go inside, where we can see the old photographs of the former pupils who died during First and Second World Wars, and of course that includes John Kipling, and also their names are inscribed on the walls.
We're now in the chapel of St Aubyn's School. Well, I'd like to read to you some of the letters that Rudyard Kipling sent to his son John while he was at the school, starting with a letter which he wrote a month after John had arrived here, whilst he was on his tour of Canada, dated October 12th, 1907. I'm very pleased to know that you like school. I feel sure that you will like it more and more as time goes on and you settle down and make your own friends. But I know exactly how homesick you feel at first. I can remember how I felt when I first went to school at Westward Ho. But my school was more than 200 miles from my home. My father and mother were in India, and I knew that I should not see them for years. The school was more than 200 boys, of all ages from 18 to 12. I was nearly the youngest, and the grub was simply beastly. Now with you, you are not 30 miles from home. You are by no means the youngest chap here, and they look after you in a way that no one ever dreamed of doing when I was young. Likewise, you have the pull of living in the village where you were born, full of all the people you have known all your life, with Auntie Georgie round the corner. 2 years later, in 1909, Kipling wrote again, this time from Bateman's. Dear old man, I wasn't going to write to you this week on account of coming over on Saturday, but seeing that your sports begin on Saturday, I just want to breathe a few moral maxims in your ear. You are now getting on in life, and I want your behaviour to correspond with your years. Therefore, O my son, do all that you can to win honestly and fairly in the events for which you have entered. If you win, shut your head. Exalt not yourself, nor your legs, nor your wind, nor anything else that it is yours. To boast, not that you were given to it, is the mark of the savage and the pig. If you lose, remember that you have lost. It doesn't matter one little bit, but it matters a great deal if you go about jawing about your handicap being too heavy, or you having had a bad start, or you're being tripped or put off. The man who explains why he lost and hints that under other circumstances he might have won is worse than the pig and the savage. Remember that, mon ami. And a year later, in 1910, Kipling wrote again from Bateman's. By the way, Stanford writes to me that you aren't taking much interest in your Greek and wants to know whether he shall put you on to German instead. Talk of the devil and the deep sea. I'm writing to him to say that I want you to go on with your Greek. I think that you'll agree with me that it's the best thing to do, for you'll need it if you go to a university. And from any point of view, a knowledge of Greek is worth gold and diamonds. I can ram enough German into you in 6 weeks on the continent for you to go on with. And these Xmas holidays in Engelberg, you shall have some colloquial German, enough to conduct a small conversation in. So buck up and get on with your Greek, for a man that has acquaintance with that tongue has the key that unlocks half the real wisdom of the world. Now, after John's 4 years here, he went on to Wellington, and from Wellington, of course, he, shortly after leaving, joined the army because the First World War had begun. And sadly, the main reason we're here in this chapel is to look at the memorials to John, and indeed to all of the other old boys who died in the First World War. But I thought, whilst we were looking at those, I'd also read to you John's final letter to his father, dated Saturday, September the 25th, 1915. Dear F, just a hurried line as we start off tonight. The front line trenches are 9 miles off from here, so it won't be a very long march. This is the great effort to break through and end the war. The guns have been going deafeningly all day without a single stop. We have to push through at all costs, so we won't have much time in the trenches, which is great luck. Funny to think one will be in the thick of it tomorrow. One's first experience of shell fire, not in the trenches but in the open. This is one of the advantages of a flying division. You have to keep moving. We marched 18 miles last night in the pouring wet. It came down in sheets steadily. They are staking a tremendous lot on this great advancing movement. As if it succeeds, the war won't go on for long. You have no idea what enormous issues depend on the next few days. This will be my last letter most likely for some time, as we won't get any time for writing this next week. But I will try and send field postcards. Well, so long, old dears. Dear love, John. That, of course, was the last that Rudyard and Carrie ever heard from their son.
We've just entered the Grange, which now serves as the local library on the ground floor, but upstairs is the museum and art gallery. So we're now going to go upstairs to look at a reproduction of Kipling's study. Well, we're now in the study, reproduced study of Kipling, and they have done it in a way that no doubt Rudyard would have approved. Or he probably wouldn't actually know Rudyard. It just gives you a sense of the man at work. But what is particularly lovely here is behind here on the wall are these photographs of the family when they were living here in Rottingdean. And Kipling was also very much a keen photographer. And these photographs are kept at the keep at Falmer, which is the East Sussex Record Office, and they've kindly allowed these photographs to appear here in this reproduction of Kipling's study. And it's worth spending 5 minutes or more just to look at these lovely nostalgic photographs of the Kiplings and their family at a particularly happy time in their lives. Also on display is a collection of music, of settings to some of Kipling's famous poems. There's there's the Fringes of the Fleet, written by Rudyard Kipling, music by Edward Elgar. Boots, words by Rudyard Kipling, music by J.P.F. McCall. The Absent-Minded Beggar, of course, by music by Arthur Sullivan, and several other examples of how Rudyard's poems have been set to music. Well, we're now in the Burne-Jones room in the museum, where they've got a fascinating display retelling Burne-Jones's life, and of course lots of examples of his artwork are to be seen here. So one of those places well worth spending 10 minutes to go around and reading all about the life of Sir Edward Burne-Jones. Just near the entrance to the church, you'll see the two memorial tablets to Edward Burne-Jones and Georgiana. Sir Edward died in 1898. He died in London, and he asked to be cremated, which was quite rare in those days, because it was only in 1885 that cremation had been made legal. But that was his request, that he be cremated, and there was at that time only one crematorium in the country, which was at Woking. So his body was taken to Woking, where it was cremated, and then his ashes were brought back here to Rottingdean and buried in this spot, because he chose this spot because directly opposite where I'm standing is the green, and just beyond it is North End House, where he'd enjoyed so many years. And of course, when Georgie died in 1920, she asked that her remains be placed next to her husband's here by the churchyard wall. So I'm now going to hand over to Mike, who's going to talk about Angela Thirkell, who was of course the Burne-Joneses' granddaughter.
Just in front of where Burne-Jones is commemorated, Angela Thirkell had her ashes buried, and on that there was a wooden memorial which she wanted to be allowed to decay over time, and that has now completely disappeared and is more or less in the spot where I'm standing. However, what survives is a memorial to her daughter Mary, who died sadly before she turned 1, and that board can be seen just here, and on the side that's a little bit more legible still, it says, "The bird is dead that we have made so much on," which is a quote from Shakespeare's Cymbeline. And on the back, which is hardly legible today, is just the single word Mary.
So you'll see behind me the stained glass windows that was designed by Sir Edward Burne-Jones and manufactured by William Morris and Company. And they were designed to celebrate the wedding of the Burne-Joneses' daughter in 1895.
Also buried in St Margaret's churchyard is Cormel Price, Kipling's old headmaster from Westward Ho. It took a bit of gardening to reveal his grave. And on the way to Crom's grave, we spotted that of Michael Smith, a former chairman of the Kipling Society an author of Kipling's Sussex.
Right, well, we've very kindly been given permission by the present owner of the Elms to go inside. So follow me as we go inside and have a look at the Elms garden. Right, well, we're now standing outside the Elms, where of course the Kiplings lived for 5 years. It was a particularly happy time of their lives, particularly the first 18 months or so, because John was born around that time in 1897, and Rudyard felt he had the son and heir to go along with his 2 daughters. Sadly, as we all know, that changed in 1899 after they made their visit to America and Josephine passed away. But it's a great privilege to be standing here right outside the very house itself, and in the window behind me, in the bay window behind me, that was, I believe, Kipling's study, where of course he wrote so many of his most famous works. Right, we're now standing on the green just by the Elms, and from this spot, if we look over there, is North End House, where the Burne-Joneses lived, and if we look over there is the Dean, where the Ridsdales lived, and immediately behind me is the wall, and just behind the wall is the Elms, where the Kiplings lived. And of course Kipling said in his autobiography that you could throw a cricket ball between the houses, and as you can see, they really are just a few yards apart. We're now standing outside the Kipling Gardens, which were originally part of the gardens of the Elms. The Elms was bought in 1929 by Sir Roderick Jones, who was the chairman of Reuters, and his wife was Enid Bagnold, who wrote National Velvet. The family owned the house until 1980, when they sold it, and the plan was to sell off the gardens, which by this time had become something of a wilderness, for redevelopment. The people of Rottingdean then got together and raised £51,000 to buy the gardens, and they've since been restored and are now owned by Brighton Council, and the gardens are open every day of the year for everyone to enjoy. So we're now going to go inside and have a look round the Kipling Gardens. On the wall here is a tablet quoting a verse from Kipling's famous poem, The Glory of the Garden. Our England is a garden that is full of stately views, of borders, beds and shrubberies, and lawns and avenues, with statues on the terraces and peacocks strutting by. But the glory of the garden lies in more than meets the eye. The roses now are in full bloom. Today there's a croquet lawn, which of course wouldn't have been here when Kipling lived here, but from here you get a good view of the back of the Elms. And this of course was all part of the Kipling's garden when they lived here. So standing here, looking westwards, over on the hill in the distance, we can see the famous Rottingdean windmill. This windmill is known to many thousands of people as it forms the logo of the publisher Heinemann and Company, and it was designed by Sir William Nicholson, the father of the artist Ben Nicholson, who also lived in the village and lived in the Grange.